I walked out of my small apartment on Bridge Street at 6 o'clock in the morning, sharp. The sun was barely above the horizon, coloring the sky of Yuba City a soft pink. I'd always loved this time of day, when the city was still asleep and the streets belonged to me alone. At 68 years old, I've kept the habit of getting up early. They say people need less sleep as they age. Maybe so. But I think I just don't want to spend the time I have left in bed. My daily route has been the same for years. First Turnbull's Bakery, which serves the best coffee in town, then a walk along the Feather River, and finally my restaurant. However, few people know that it is I, Winston Pierce, who owns the Coastal. To most, I'm just an old man who helps with small errands and occasionally chats with customers. I pushed open the restaurant's service door and stepped inside. The cooks were already starting their work, and the smell of freshly baked bread filled the kitchen. "Good morning, Mr. Pierce." Everett, the chef who had been here for 8 years, greeted me. "Morning, Everett. What are we having today?" "I've decided to add a new dish to the menu, trout with herbs and lemon sauce. Would you like to try it?" I nodded and took a seat at a small table in the corner of the kitchen. Watching the kitchen work was one of my favorite things to do. The deft movements of the cooks, the clinking of dishes, the sizzling of oil in the pans. It all added up to a special symphony that I never tired of listening to. Coastal became mine 15 years ago when the previous owner, my old friend Paul Abbott, decided to retire and move to Florida. We had known each other since our youth, and when he offered to buy the restaurant, I didn't hesitate for a minute. After 30 years of working for a construction company, I had saved enough money to afford such an acquisition. By then, my marriage to Helen was already bursting at the seams. Our son Keith had just graduated from college and moved to San Francisco, and Helen and I realized that in our 25 years together, we had become strangers. Divorce was inevitable, but we managed to maintain our friendship. Helen died 5 years ago of cancer. We hadn't been together for 10 years by then, but her death was a heavy blow to me. Keith reacted strangely, as if he hadn't lost his mother, but just a distant relative. He came to the funeral with his wife Rosemary. They stood stone-faced at the grave and flew out the same day. Everett set a plate of trout in front of me. "You were right about the saffron, Mr. Pierce. It does make the sauce richer." I smiled and tasted the fish. The tender meat melted in my mouth, and the sauce complemented the flavor perfectly. "Excellent, Everett. Add it to the menu." The chef glowed and returned to the stove. Everyone in the restaurant knew that I always had the last word, even though Holden Neal, my manager, was the owner. It had been that way since the beginning. I never sought to be the center of attention, preferring to stay in the shadows. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe that's why my son thinks I'm a loser. My relationship with Keith has never been easy. Even when Helen and I were still together, he was always closer to his mother. She spoiled him, and I tried to discipline him, which often led to conflict. After the divorce, he practically stopped talking to me, and when Helen got sick, he accused me of abandoning her when she needed me most. It wasn't fair. I helped Helen financially, visited her in the hospital, but Keith only saw what he wanted to see. Besides, by then he was already married to Rosemary Elliott, a former model who worked as an image consultant for some tech startups. She looked down on me from the start, like a redneck unworthy of attention. For the last few years, our communication with my son was limited to occasional calls at Christmas and his birthday. He never asked me how I lived, what I did. To him, I was still the same construction worker I was when he was growing up, only older and apparently out of his mind. Keith didn't know that I owned the Coastal, one of the most successful restaurants in Yuba City. Didn't know that 3 years ago, I opened a second restaurant in Sacramento that is also thriving. Didn't know that I was richer now than I had ever been in my life. I never told him about it, partly out of pride, partly because I wanted him to appreciate me not for the money, but for being his father. A foolish hope, perhaps, for a man of my age. At noon, the first customers began arriving at the restaurant. I changed into my usual attire, simple pants, shirt, and vest, and went out into the hall to help set the tables and occasionally talk to the guests. Many of the regulars knew me as Old Vinny and liked to have a word with me. "How are your roses, Mr. Bennett?" I asked an elderly gentleman who came to lunch every Thursday. "Oh, Winnie, they're especially good this year. Must be the rainy spring. You must come and see them sometime." "I will, sir. What will you be ordering today?" That's how my day went. Talking, running errands, and keeping an eye on the restaurant. Toward evening, Holden, my manager and the only friend I trusted, arrived. Holden was 20 years younger than me, but we got along just fine. He had come to work as a waiter under Paul, and I immediately noticed his organizational skills. When I bought the restaurant, I asked him to take over, and I never regretted it. "Good news, Vince," he said as he walked into my office at the back of the restaurant. "We've been named one of the best restaurants in Northern California by Gourmet magazine." "Not bad for a country joint," I smiled. "No, come on, you always knew we had a special place." We discussed current affairs, the problem with the wine suppliers and the need to update the menu for the summer season. The usual worries of a restaurateur, which I found oddly soothing. When Holden left, I was alone in the study. A small room with a desk, a few chairs, and a bookcase was my sanctuary. Here I could quietly review papers, plan my budget, and sometimes just think about life. On the desk was a picture of Helen, the only one I'd kept since my divorce. It had been taken on Keith's birthday when he turned 10. Helen was smiling at the camera, putting her arm around her son's shoulders. I remember that day. We had a party in the park, invited all his friends. Keith was happy then. We were all happy. The phone rang, interrupting my musings. I glanced at the screen and was surprised to see my son's name. Keith never just called, especially not on a Thursday night. "Hi, Keith," I answered, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Dad," his voice sounded strained and polite. "How are you doing?" "I'm okay. How are you?" "I'm fine. Listen, Rosemary and I have a 10-year wedding anniversary coming up. It's next Saturday. We're having a dinner for close friends and family at the Coastal Restaurant in Yuba City. I'm told it's a good place." I almost choked up. Keith was going to celebrate his anniversary at my restaurant and didn't even realize it. "Yeah, it's not a bad place," I replied cautiously. "Anyway, we'd like you to come too." It starts at 7 in the evening. The invitation sounded formal, without much warmth, but it was still an invitation. The first one in years. "Thank you, Keith. I'll be there." "Okay then, see you then." He hung up without waiting for my reply. Typical Keith, always busy, always in a hurry. I leaned back in my chair, contemplating the situation. My son is going to celebrate an important event at my restaurant, not knowing that I own it. Well, it's going to be an interesting evening. I left the office and headed toward the bar where Holden was looking over the wine list. "Holden, do we have a reservation for next Saturday from Keith and Rosemary Pierce?" He checked in the clipboard. "Yes, table for 12, 7 o'clock that evening. Wedding anniversary. That's your son, right?" "Yeah, he just invited me." "Doesn't know I own the restaurant." Holden whistled. "That's quite a coincidence. You gonna tell him?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to finally reveal the truth, but the other part, the more stubborn part, resisted. "No, not yet. Let it go. You'll pretend I'm just working here like I always do." "Whatever you say, Vince, it's your family." I nodded and went to help the waiter set up. The evening was in full swing, and the restaurant was filled with people, but my thoughts were far away. I was thinking about my upcoming meeting with my son and daughter, in-law, how they would react when they finally learned the truth, if they ever learned it at all. Maybe the anniversary invitation was a chance to mend the relationship. Maybe Keith has finally matured enough to appreciate the importance of family bonds. Or maybe he just needs to fill a seat at the table to make it look right. Either way, I've decided that I'm going to go to this dinner and act my usual demeanor, modest and low-key. After all, the waterfront was my home more than any other place in this town, and I wasn't going to pretend to be anyone else, even for my son's sake. When the last customers had left and the staff had started cleaning up, I stepped out onto the restaurant's terrace overlooking the river. The night was quiet, only occasionally disturbed by the sounds of passing cars. The river glistened in the moonlight, calm and majestic. I thought about how strangely life works out. At 68, I had finally achieved the financial success that many only dream of, but I had lost what really mattered, the bond with my only son. Was this loss permanent, or was there still a chance to make things right? I didn't know the answer, but an upcoming dinner might have given me a clue. Saturday morning was surprisingly cool for late June. I woke up earlier than usual, feeling strangely anxious. The day of my upcoming meeting with my son had finally arrived. I stood under the shower for a long time, letting the hot water wash away the tension that had built up over the past week. Thoughts of Keith kept me awake, After my divorce from Helen, our relationship with our son had immediately frayed. He was 23, fresh out of college, and thought he had the right to judge me for destroying my family. Of course, he didn't know all the details. He didn't know about his mother's constant cheating, the years of Cold War between us, the fact that the divorce was a mutual decision. To him, I was the villain who abandoned his mother. I remember our last serious fight. It was the second day after Helen's funeral. We were sitting in her house, me, Keith, and Rosemary, who had then been his wife for almost 5 years. "So you're going to sell the house?" Hey, Keith asked when I mentioned the need to sort out Helen's things. "It's not my house, Keith," I replied. "Your mother has lived here for the last 15 years. According to her will, it passes to you. Surely you couldn't have helped her keep this house when she was sick?" His voice oozed venom. "Or were you too busy with your new life?" I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I was helping her, Keith. All the medical bills." "Don't talk to me about money," he interrupted. "Money is all you've ever cared about. Never time, never attention, just the checks." "It's not fair," I said quietly. "Unfair?" He was almost shouting now. "You know what's unfair? That she died alone while you—" "She wasn't alone," I started to raise my voice too. "I was at the hospital with her every day for the last month." "Where have you been, Keith?" "In Europe at your very important business event." Keith's face turned pale with anger. "Don't you dare accuse me. You have no idea how hard I worked to—" "To what?" I asked. "To impress people who don't care about you? To buy another expensive toy?" That's when Rosemary intervened. She put her hand on her husband's shoulder and said with an icy calm, "I think we should go now, dear. Your father is obviously too upset to have a sensible conversation." That was our last real conversation. From then on, Keith and I exchanged only formal greetings on holidays. And when we met casually at family events, we kept an emphatically polite and detached demeanor. I stepped out of the shower and shaved thoroughly. The mirror reflected a face marked by the years. Wrinkles around my eyes, gray hair, deep creases around my mouth. But the eyes were still clear and alive. I never felt my 68 years until I met my son. Next to him, I always felt ancient and unnecessary. For tonight, I chose my usual work attire. Dark blue slacks, white shirt, and gray vest. Nothing about my appearance was meant to give away that I was a restaurant owner. To Keith and Rosemary, I would be just an old geezer helping out in the lounge. I arrived at the restaurant around 11. I usually showed up later on Saturdays, but today, I wanted to personally oversee the preparations for the evening's event. The Coastal was already bustling with life. The staff was setting tables for the lunch crowd, the cooks were preparing preparations for the evening meal, and the bartenders were checking the stock. "Good morning, Mr. Pierce." Nora, the head hostess, greeted me. "You're early today." "It's a special day, Nora," I smiled. "My son and his wife will be celebrating their wedding anniversary here." Her eyes widened with surprise. "You never mentioned your son, sir." "We're not very close," I replied, heading towards my office. "And by the way, he doesn't know that I own this place, so please don't mention it." "Of course, Mr. Pierce," she nodded, though I could tell by the look on her face that she found the situation odd. In the study, I looked over Keith's reservation. A table for 12, with a celebratory menu and champagne ordered, all paid for in advance by credit card. Typical Keith, always needing to show he's on the money. I remember a few years ago, during one of our rare meetings, he tried to impress me with his new car, some expensive German model I didn't even remember the name of. He talked about it as if it were the greatest achievement of mankind, not just a means of transportation. "Impressive," I said without much enthusiasm. "You just don't understand," Keith replied with ill-concealed irritation. "It's not just a car, it's a status symbol." "Is status that important to you?" I asked. He looked at me with ill-concealed superiority. "Unlike you, I understand how the world works. People judge you by your looks, by what you have." "What do you have, Keith, besides a car and an expensive watch?" He didn't answer, just snorted and changed the subject. I think that's when I finally realized that my son and I were speaking different languages. For me, life had always been about simple things: work that was satisfying, people to spend time with, a place to call my own. For Keith, it's about outward glitz, about impressing others, about the eternal chase for phantom success. The office door opened and Holden entered. He hadn't changed much in the 15 years of our friendship. The same shrewd brown eyes, only there was more gray in his dark hair and more wrinkles in the corners of his eyes. "You're early today," he said, sitting down in the chair across from me. "I wanted to check on the preparations for tonight." "Everything will be perfect," he assured me. "I'm personally supervising every detail. Your son and daughter-in-law will be satisfied." "If there's anything to satisfy them," I muttered. Holden looked at me carefully. "You still haven't decided whether to tell them the truth or not?" I shook my head. "I think I'll leave it at that, at least for tonight. I don't want to create an awkward situation during their celebration." "Maybe it would be a good time to clear the air," Holden suggested. "You always said you wanted an honest relationship with your son." "Honesty works both ways," I sighed. "Keith has never been interested in my life. In the 5 years since Helen's death, he'd never once asked me how I lived, what I did. To him, I'm still the same construction worker I was 30 years ago." Holden nodded, accepting my point of view. He was one of the few people who really understood the complexity of my relationship with Keith. "In any case," he said, rising, "I'll make sure you don't have to serve their table. You can just attend as a guest." "No," I said firmly. "I will work as usual. If they invited me just as a courtesy, well, I can be just as polite." After Holden left, I was alone in my office, immersed in my memories. In front of me on the desk was the same picture of Helen with 10-year-old Keith. I remembered what he had been like as a child. Inquisitive, emotional, eager for attention. When had things changed? When had that look of condescending superiority appeared in his eyes? Perhaps after college, when he started working for a financial firm in San Francisco, or after marrying Rosemary, who always looked at me like I was something stuck to the sole of her expensive shoes. Or maybe it happened gradually, unnoticed by both of us. I remembered the only time I'd met Rosemary before they were married. Keith had brought her to meet Helen and me. We were already divorced then, but had decided to have dinner together for our son's sake. Rosemary was beautiful. There's no denying it. Tall, slim, with flawless features and cold blue eyes. She'd worked as a model then, when her career went south, had retrained as an image consultant. During dinner, she talked mostly about the celebrities she worked with, fashion trends, and her plans to open her own agency. "What do you do, Mr. Pierce?" "Near a year," she asked at one point, as if she had just remembered I existed. "I used to work in construction," I replied. "Retired now." "Oh," she said with ill-concealed disappointment. "As usual." That tone, that look on her face, they spoke louder than any words. I was nothing to her, a man from another, lower world. And the saddest part was that Keith was looking at her with adoration at that moment, fully accepting her value system. I left the office and headed for the lounge. The staff had already started preparing for the evening event, sliding tables, changing tablecloths, arranging flowers. I approached Emma, the head waitress who had worked at the waterfront almost from the beginning. "Mr. Pierce, everything will be ready on time," she assured me. "Hey, Holden said they were special guests." "My son and his wife," I replied. "But they don't know I own the restaurant, so please." "We understand," Emma smiled. "For them, you are just a helper in the hall." "Thank you." I walked around the restaurant, checking every detail, from the cleanliness of the tables to the freshness of the flowers. Coastal was my pride, the result of years of labor, and I wanted everything to be perfect tonight. Not to impress Keith and Rosemary, but simply because I had always strived for perfection in everything I did. By 5 o'clock, the restaurant had emptied after the day's flood of customers, and the final preparations for the evening's event had begun. I changed into a clean shirt and helped the staff with the finishing touches, arranging the name cards for the guests, checking the wines, making sure the cake for the Jubilees was delivered and matched the order. At 6:30, I walked into the kitchen where Chef Everett was preparing a special menu for tonight. "Everything is top-notch, Mr. Pierce," he assured me. "Your son and his guests will be pleased." "I don't doubt it, Everett," I smiled. "You never fail." It was 6:45 when I walked out into the hall and saw Holden greeting the first guests. They were Keith and Rosemary's friends, a young couple in expensive clothes with loud voices and confident manners. They belonged to the world that was so important to my son, the world of ostentatious success and superficial relationships. "Have Mr. and Mrs. Pierce arrived yet?" I asked Holden when most of the guests had already taken their seats. No, but they had reservations for 7, so they should be here any minute. I nodded and walked back to the bar, pretending to check the supplies. My heart was beating faster than usual. Despite all my resolutions to remain calm and detached, I couldn't help but feel anxious before meeting my son. After all, he was my only family. At precisely 7 o'clock, the restaurant doors opened, and in they walked. Keith and Rosemary, Pierce, the culprits of the occasion. My son had changed little in the 2 years we had not seen each other. Still as tall and trim, in an impeccable suit with a neatly trimmed beard. Rosemary looked flawless beside him in an elegant ivory dress, with perfect hair and makeup. Holden met them at the entrance and led them to the table where their friends were already waiting. I watched them from afar, taking my time to make my presence known. Keith was smiling and shaking hands, Rosemary accepting congratulations with that look of a queen condescending to her subjects. "Had you changed your mind?" Holden asked quietly as he passed me. "No," I answered firmly. "Everything remains as it is. For now, at least." I wasn't sure I was making the right decision by keeping the truth from my son. Maybe honesty really would be the best policy. But something inside me, pride, stubbornness, or maybe just fatigue from years of estrangement, wouldn't let me make the first move. Let things take their course, I decided. Tonight I would be just another guest at my son's party, an inconspicuous figure on the periphery of his life. And tomorrow? Well, tomorrow would be a new day. When I finally arrived at the table where Keith and Rosemary were sitting, the atmosphere was already electrified with laughter and clinking glasses. I was in no hurry to reveal myself, giving them time to enjoy the beginning of the evening. As I watched from the sidelines, I noted how confident my son was among his friends, talking and gesticulating, and everyone listening with genuine interest. At such times, he reminded me of Helen, and she, too, could be the soul of the company. "Daddy," Keith saw me first and stood up to greet me. There was no warmth in his voice, but rather a polite formality. "You came after all." "I promised," I replied, shaking his outstretched hand. "Rosemary, my father's here," Keith announced to his wife, who was busy talking to a woman sitting next to him. She turned around and gave me an appraising look, faintly wincing at the sight of my simple attire. "Winston?" She nodded without getting up. "I'm glad you could join us." "Happy anniversary," I said, trying to sound sincere. Keith pointed to an empty seat at the table farthest from the center where he and Rosemary sat. "We were holding a seat for you." I sat silently, watching Keith return to the interrupted conversation with his friends. No introduction of me to the other guests. No attempt to include me in the conversation. I was just a formally invited relative that politeness wouldn't allow me to ignore. The waiters began bringing out the appetizers. Salmon tartare with avocado and capers, our restaurant's signature dish. I knew it was perfect. Everett and I had personally selected the salmon from the supplier yesterday morning, but instead of enjoying the food, I felt strangely alienated, as if I were watching a scene from a movie in which I was playing a minor role. "So what do you do, Mr. Pierce?" asked the woman sitting next to me, who introduced herself as Audrey, a friend of Rosemary's. "I'm retired," I replied with the standard phrase I used in such cases. "Oh," she said with a polite smile. "And what do you do in retirement?" "I help out at a local restaurant," I said without going into details. "And you?" "I work in public relations," Audrey replied. "Rosemary and I met when I was organizing a charity event, and she was a style consultant." Our conversation was interrupted by loud laughter from across the table. Keith was telling a story, and everyone was listening intently. And that's when I said to this guy, "If you can't tell the difference between futures and options, maybe you should go back to business school." He finished, and the company erupted into laughter. I smiled weakly, not understanding the joke, but feeling I had to respond somehow. Keith glanced at me and said something quietly to Rosemary. She nodded, casting a condescending glance in my direction. "It must be exhausting working in finance," I said, trying to make conversation. Keith looked at me with slight irritation, as if I had interrupted an important conversation. "No more tedious than any other job that requires intelligence and specialized knowledge," he answered with a hint. "Of course," I agreed, feeling myself blush at his tone. "Winston has always been a man of physical labor," Rosemary explained with a fake smile. "He'd been a construction worker all his life, right?" Yes, pretty much, I confirmed, not realizing that I'd been the owner of the restaurant where they were sitting for the past 15 years. It's noble work, one of Keith's friends said condescendingly. Someone has to build the houses we live in. I remained silent, not wanting to continue this awkward conversation. Meanwhile, the main course was served, filet mignon with truffle sauce and seasonal vegetables. I knew the meat was perfectly seared, the sauce was made from Everett's special recipe, and the vegetables were grown on a local organic farm. But watching Keith meticulously examine his plate, I suddenly felt a strange unease. The meat's a little overcooked, he said loudly, cutting into the steak. I asked for medium rare. I knew that wasn't true. The meat was exactly the way he'd ordered it. I checked the order myself. Let me check, I said, rising. Maybe there's been a mistake. Don't bother, Dad, Keith said. I already told the waiter. I saw him call Emma over and say something to her. She listened with a professional smile and nodded, though I could see her shoulders tense. Your father's very caring, another guest sitting next to Keith remarked. Oh, yeah, he replied with a faint sneer in his voice. Dad's always been very attentive to detail, especially the ones that concerned him directly. What do you mean? I asked, feeling the tension building inside. Nothing in particular, Keith shrugged. It's just that you've always been more focused on the little things than on the big picture. Little things? I asked, trying to stay calm. Yeah, like exactly how much money was spent on something, or exactly who said what, he paused. It's normal. Everyone has their priorities. I felt the blood rush to my face. Keith was alluding to our old arguments about money, about how I was supposedly too stingy to help my family. It was unfair and hurtful, especially here in front of his friends. I think it's important to pay attention to details, I said. They often tell more than the big picture. Sure, Dad, Keith smiled indulgently. Whatever you say. Rosemary put her hand gently on her husband's shoulder. Darling, remember when we wanted to tell everyone about our trip to Italy? I realized that I was being neatly excluded from the conversation. Keith readily switched to a new topic, beginning to tell me about their recent vacation on the Amalfi Coast. I silently ate my steak, which of course was perfectly cooked. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Holden watching our table intently from behind the bar. He knew me well enough to see that I was upset. And then this local chef invited us over for a tasting. Can you believe it? Just because we were talking about traditional cuisine, Keith continued his story, clearly enjoying the attention. He probably thought you were Michelin critics, someone joked. I don't think so, Rosemary smiled. It's more likely that he just appreciated our taste. Keith knows about good food. I couldn't take it. In fact, Coastal has some of the best food in Northern California, I said. The restaurant had recently been recognized by the... Dad, please, Keith interrupted me with undisguised irritation. We were talking about Italian food, not local eateries. Coastal isn't a diner, I countered, feeling my anger rising inside me. It's one of the best restaurants in the region. How do you know what a good restaurant is? Rosemary snorted, exchanging glances with her friends. You've been eating in diners all your life. I've had enough experience to recognize good food, I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. Sure, Rosemary smiled indulgently. Just like you know about wine and art, right? There were restrained chuckles around the table. I felt the color flood my face. They were openly mocking me, and I couldn't do anything about it without revealing my secret. I don't claim to be an expert, I said, trying to maintain my dignity. But I know I'm talking about the Coastal. Keith rolled his eyes defiantly. Dad works here, he explained to his friends. He helps out with some small errands. He thinks that makes him an expert in the restaurant business. I froze, stunned by his words. He hadn't just downplayed my role. He'd made me look like some pathetic old man clinging to the illusion of importance. I'm not just helping, I started, but Rosemary interrupted me again. Winston, why don't you ask for more wine? She said it in the tone one uses when addressing waitstaff. I'm not a waiter, I said quietly but firmly. Oh, I'm sorry, she apologized falsely. Sometimes it's hard to know exactly what your duties are here. Don't mind my father, Keith said, addressing everyone at the table. He sometimes confuses reality. Age, you know. I felt something snap inside me. It wasn't just neglect anymore. It was outright humiliation. My own son was accusing me of senile dementia in front of strangers. I understand reality, Keith, I said, getting up from the table. Better than you think. Where are you going? He asked with mild irritation. We hadn't gotten to the cake yet. I'll be back soon, I replied, holding back the tremor in my voice. I headed toward the bar, where Holden was wiping glasses, watching carefully. Is everything okay, Vince? He asked quietly as I approached. No, I answered honestly. Not okay at all. I saw them talking to you. It's unacceptable. They think I'm some old servant, I said, feeling bitterness rise to my throat. My own son called me a crazy old man. Holden set down the glass he was wiping and put his hand on my shoulder. What do you want to do? I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. Years of accumulated resentment, frustration, and pain suddenly crystallized into a clear decision. I want them to know the truth, I said. But not just like that. I want to teach them a lesson. Holden nodded, not asking any more questions. What do I need to do? I told him my plan, the one that had been forming in my head as I sat at that humiliating table. Holden listened attentively, nodding occasionally. Are you sure? He asked when I was done. This could permanently ruin your relationship. What relationship, Hold? I grinned bitterly. It's already broken. He doesn't see me as a father, only as a burden, a miserable old man who has to be taken care of out of a sense of duty. It's time to show him who I really am. Holden was silent for a moment, then nodded. Good, I'll get everything organized. Give me 10 minutes. While Holden stepped away to give the necessary orders, I returned to the table. Dinner went on as if nothing had happened. Keith told another story about his business exploits. Rosemary kept the conversation going with witty comments. No one even noticed my return. I sat back in my seat and watched in silence, knowing that everything was about to change. Conflicting feelings raged inside of me. Anger and resentment struggled with the love I still felt for my son, despite everything. Part of me wanted to stop what was being planned, to maintain the status quo, no matter how painful it was. But another, stronger part demanded justice. Keith was just finishing up a story about a deal he'd recently made when I noticed Holden signaling to the waiters. Here we go. Can you believe this old fool tried to get me to lower my commission? Keith said, unaware that his world was about to turn upside down. I told him, look, if you want to work with the best, you have to be willing to pay for it. Very sensible, Rosemary agreed, stroking his arm. I noticed Emma and the other waiters starting to bring in bottles of champagne on silver trays. It wasn't the champagne Keith had ordered. I'd ordered the most expensive we had, a Dom Perignon from my personal stock. What is it? Keith asked in surprise, looking at the waiters. We didn't order champagne served like this. It's a gift from the owner of the restaurant, sir, Emma replied with a flawless professional smile. He wanted to personally congratulate you on your wedding anniversary. Rosemary visibly perked up. Sonor, how nice, she said, obviously flattered by the attention. Is the owner here? I'd like to thank him personally. Of course, ma'am, Emma nodded. He'll join you in a moment. I saw Keith and Rosemary exchange satisfied glances. They probably thought they had made an impression on someone. It almost made me laugh at the thought. Mr. Holden Neal, manager of the Coastal Restaurant, the maitre d' formally announced, and Holden stepped to the center of the room. Ladies and gentlemen, he began solemnly, tonight is a very special evening. We are celebrating the 10th anniversary of Mr. and Mrs. Pierce's marriage, and the owner of our restaurant would like to personally congratulate them on this momentous occasion. All heads turned toward the door, waiting for the owner to appear, but I remained seated at the table, watching the slight confusion appear on Keith and Rosemary's faces. Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce the owner of the Coastal Restaurant? Holden continued, pausing for effect. Mr. Winston Pierce. There was complete silence. All eyes turned to me, and Keith's face showed shock mixed with disbelief. Rosemary froze with her glass in her hand. Her impeccable mask of social graces cracked, revealing confusion. I rose slowly from my seat, feeling strangely calm. The moment I'd been waiting for and dreading at the same time had finally arrived. Thank you, Holden, I said, stepping out into the center of the room. Indeed, I would like to personally congratulate my son and his wife on this special day. The guests looked from me to Keith and back again, trying to make sense of what was happening. and I looked directly into my son's eyes, reading in them a whole range of emotions, from shock to slowly growing understanding. "Dad, what's the big joke?" Keith finally squeezed out, trying to save face in front of his friends. "It's not a joke, son," I said calmly. "I really own this restaurant, and another one in Sacramento, for 15 years now." Keith's face slowly paled, and Rosemary looked like she was getting sick. "I decided it was time to tell the truth," I continued, watching as my words struck them like physical blows. "And to have a special surprise for you, too." I nodded to Holden, and he handed me a file. "What's this?" Keith asked, unmoving. "It's my anniversary present to you," I said, opening the folder. But first I'd like everyone to know who I really am." The silence in the restaurant was so thick you could touch it with your hands. All the guests were frozen like figures in a wax museum. I stood in front of the table with the folder in my hands, feeling strangely calm. Years of secrecy, years of holding back my true feelings. All of that was over in an instant. 15 years ago, I began, looking straight into Keith's eyes. "After my divorce from your mother, I decided to change my life. My job in construction allowed me to save up enough money to buy this restaurant from an old friend of mine. The Coastal was a small but promising establishment at the time. I put all my savings and my soul into it." I paused, watching my son's reaction. Keith sat motionless, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. Rosemary beside him looked as if someone had just given her the news of the end of the world. "Over the years," I continued, "Coastal has become one of the best restaurants in Northern California. 3 years ago, I opened a second establishment in Sacramento, which is also quite successful." I turned to the guests, who listened to me with undisguised interest. I never wanted to publicize my success. It was more important to me to create a place I could be proud of than to brag about my accomplishments. But today I decided it was time to reveal the truth. One of Keith's friends, the same one who had spoken condescendingly of the noble work of the builders, was now looking at me with frank amazement. "So you didn't," he began, "not just a helper in the hall?" I finished for him with a slight chuckle. "No, I own this restaurant. All the staff, all the property." Keith finally found the ability to speak. "Why didn't you say anything?" His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Did you ask?" I answered a question with a question. "In the last 5 years since your mother's death, how many times have you taken an interest in my life, Keith? My affairs, my successes or failures?" He was silent, and that silent answer was more eloquent than any words. "I've been waiting," I continued, "for you to show some interest in my life. Not because of money or status, but because I'm your father. But to you, I've always been an old construction worker, a relic of the past, a burden to be remembered on holidays." Rosemary finally came out of her daze. Her flawless makeup couldn't hide the pallor that covered her face. "Winston," she began with a fake smile. "This terrific news. We're so happy for you. Why didn't you tell us before? We would have." "You would have what?" I interrupted her. "Would you have treated me differently? With more respect? Just because I have money and a successful business?" She fell silent, confused by my direct question. "Less than an hour ago," I continued, addressing everyone here, "my son called me a crazy old man. His wife treated me like a servant. And this is not the first time. For years I had endured their neglect, their condescension, their assurance that I was a loser, not worthy of their attention." Keith began to blush, either from shame or anger, his hands resting on the table, clenched into fists. "Dad, why don't we talk about this in private?" He tried to turn the conversation around. "Why?" I asked. "You weren't shy about humiliating me in front of your friends. Why should I be embarrassed to tell the truth?" I opened the folder I had been holding in my hands all this time. "But I didn't just want to tell you about my situation. I have a gift for you for your wedding anniversary." Holden walked over to me and held out an envelope. I pulled out a piece of paper and unfolded it for everyone to see. "This is the bill for tonight," I announced. "Normally, a dinner for 12 would cost about $3,000, including champagne. But for you, my dear son, I have prepared a special bill." I turned the sheet toward Keith, and his eyes widened when he saw the amount. $35,000? He read aloud. "Are you kidding me?" "No, it's not a joke," I replied calmly. It includes the cost of all the times you made me feel like a jerk. All the times you didn't bother to call to see how I was doing. All the times your wife looked at me like I was dirt under her shoes. A whisper drifted through the room. The guests looked at each other, clearly feeling out of place having witnessed this family drama. But that's not all, I continued, pulling another document out of the folder. Remember 7 years ago, when you were in a financial hole and you urgently needed $100,000 to cover your debts? You came to me and I gave you that money, even though it was a significant portion of my savings at the time. Keith's face grew even paler. He had never told his friends, and I suspect not even Rosemary, about this loan. You said you'd pay the money back in a year. It's been 7 years. You never once mentioned the debt, never once offered to pay back even a fraction of the amount. I unfolded the document, a copy of the promissory note Keith had signed in a moment of desperation. I never reminded you of your debt because I hoped you would remember your promise. That honor and decency are no stranger to my son. Rosemary looked at her husband with ill-concealed surprise and anger. Keith, what is he talking about? What $100,000? Keith avoided her gaze, which was an answer in itself. With interest, I continued, the amount owed is now $163,000. One of Kit's friends, the one sitting closest to him, whistled quietly in surprise. Supposon, I forgive you that debt, I said, watching Keith's face lighten. But not because you deserve it, but because I don't want there to be any financial obligations between us. I want to be free of you, just like you've always wanted to be free of me. I tore the promissory note in half, then another, and another, and another, until it was left in small shreds, which I tossed onto the table. Consider it my wedding present, but you'll pay for dinner. Holden held out a credit terminal to Keith, who sat motionless as if paralyzed. $35,000? He finally squeezed it out. For a dinner for 12 people? That's robbery. No, I replied calmly. It's a lesson about the value of respect, about valuing a man for his character, not his bank account. Rosemary put her hand on her husband's shoulder. Now, Keith, let's just pay and go, she said quietly, but loud enough for me to hear. This is getting humiliating. Humiliating? I asked with a bitter chuckle. Isn't it humiliating to call your own father a servant and an old man out of his mind in front of a dozen strangers? Rosemary looked away, and Keith finally pulled out his credit card and held it out to Holden. His hand trembled slightly. You're going to regret this, he said quietly as Holden processed the transaction. Maybe, I agreed. But no more than I already regret letting you treat me like nothing all these years. The terminal beeped, signaling the completion of the transaction. Holden handed the card back to Keith and stepped away. And now, I said, turning to everyone, let me get on with the evening. After all, we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of Keith and Rosemary's marriage. I don't want my personal scores to spoil the festivities. I turned to the waiters, who had been standing against the walls the whole time, watching the drama unfold. Please bring the cake and more champagne for the guests. The waiters quickly sprang into action, clearly happy to be able to do something instead of standing around listening to our family squabble. I turned to the guests, many of whom looked like they'd rather be anywhere but here right now. I apologize for this awkward moment, I said with a smile. Family relationships can sometimes be complicated, but that shouldn't dampen the festivities. I returned to my seat at the table, noticing that Keith and Rosemary were whispering fiercely about something, probably deciding whether they should stay or go. The champagne cork popped, distracting the guests. The waiters began filling glasses and the tension in the room eased a little. I watched my son feeling a strange mixture of emotions. On the one hand, I felt satisfied that I had finally told him the truth and made him feel at least some of the humiliation he had forced me to feel for years. On the other hand, somewhere deep inside was pain. The pain of realizing that there was now a gulf between us that might never be bridged. Keith finally made a decision. He stood up, still pale, but with his head held defiantly high. Friends, he addressed the guests, Rosemary and I thank you for coming to share this special evening with us. Unfortunately, there have been some unforeseen circumstances, and we are forced to interrupt the festivities. A whisper drifted through the room again, but Keith ignored it. The cake and champagne are on the house, he continued with a strained smile. Please enjoy the rest of the evening." He turned to me and I could see the icy fury in his eyes. "We'll talk later," he said quietly. "If you want to," I replied. "I'll be here." Keith took Rosemary's hand and they headed for the exit. She walked with her head held high, but her posture was tense and her face was frozen. Holden came up to me as they disappeared out the door. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But I did what I had to do." The guests began to leave, despite the cake and champagne. No one wanted to stay after such a scandal. I didn't blame them. It wasn't the party they'd hoped for. When the last guest left, I sank down in my chair, suddenly feeling very old and very tired. The emotional rush that had sustained me during the confrontation had faded, leaving behind an emptiness and a strange melancholy. Holden sat down beside me, silently holding out a glass of whiskey. I accepted it gratefully and took a sip, feeling the hot liquid burn my throat. "Do you think I was too harsh?" I asked, looking at the amber liquid in the glass. "I think you did what you had to do," Holden replied. "They deserved it." "Maybe," I sighed, "but he's still my son." "And that's why his attitude toward you was so painful," Holden said. "Unmasking, we don't expect love and respect from strangers. We do from family." I nodded, unable to argue with his logic. "I'll go check on the staff," Holden said, getting up. "You get some rest." It had been a rough night. When he left, I was alone at a table that had been the center of the party an hour ago, but now looked like a battlefield of scattered napkins, unfinished glasses, and leftover food. The waiters were quietly cleaning up, trying not to disturb me. I didn't know if I had done the right thing by making this scene. Years of resentment and frustration needed an outlet, and today's humiliation was the last straw. But was a public confrontation the only way? Could I have talked to Keith alone, explained my feelings to him without this spectacle? Maybe. But would he have listened? Would he take my words seriously if he wasn't cornered? If he didn't feel as humiliated as I'd felt all these years? I didn't know the answer. Only knew that the bridge between me and my son, which was already fragile, was now probably shattered permanently. And part of me mourned that, even as another part of me felt the satisfaction of justice restored. My musings were interrupted by the ringing of the phone. I pulled it out of my pocket, expecting to see Keith's name, but it was an unknown number. I answered with some hesitation. "Winston Pierce speaking." "Mr. Pierce," came an unfamiliar male voice. "My name is Timothy Pratt, and I'm the attorney for your son, Keith Pierce." I felt my eyebrows creep upward in surprise. "An attorney? Keith has already hired a lawyer?" "Mr. Pierce insists that all future communication with you go through me," Pratt continued, ignoring my question. "He believes that today's incident was a deliberate act of financial and emotional abuse on your part." I couldn't believe my ears. Keith was accusing me of violence after everything he and Rosemary had done? "That's ridiculous," I said. "I was simply revealing the truth about myself and reminding him of the debt he himself had willingly taken on." "Mr. Pierce claims that you publicly humiliated him in front of his friends and colleagues, which could cause irreparable damage to his reputation and career," the lawyer continued. "In addition, you forced him to pay an exorbitant bill under threat of further public humiliation." I felt the anger boiling up inside me again. What about the fact that he and his wife had been humiliating me for years? How about tonight when they called me a servant and a senile old man out of his mind in front of those same friends? "I'm not here to discuss family dynamics, Mr. Pierce," Pratt replied coldly. "I'm calling to notify you of the possible legal ramifications of your actions. Mr. Pierce is considering filing a lawsuit for damages." I laughed, unable to contain myself. "A lawsuit? For what? For telling him the truth about me? For forgiving him a debt of $163,000? Or for daring to remind him how he should treat his father?" Pratt was silent for a moment, clearly not expecting such a reaction. "Mr. Pierce, I strongly advise you to consult your own attorney before making any further statements." "Tell Keith," I said, feeling my anger give way to fatigue, "that if he wants to sue me, let him. I'm not afraid of the truth, and I'm not afraid of him." I hung up the phone without waiting for the lawyer to answer. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from frustration. Was Keith so caught up in his pride that he was willing to take the case to court instead of just admitting he was wrong? Holden came back, and when he saw the look on my face, he knew something was wrong. What happened? Keith hired a lawyer, I answered. He's threatening to sue me for today's incident. Holden whistled. That's serious. What are you going to do? I hesitated. Part of me wanted to respond with aggression to aggression, hire the best lawyer, and give Keith a real fight. But the other part, the more tired, wiser part, knew that that would only prolong the conflict, deepen the chasm between us. Nothing yet, I said. We'll see if he really will sue, or if it's just empty threats. Holden nodded, accepting my decision. Either way, I'm on your side, Vince. Everyone in the restaurant is on your side. I smiled gratefully at him. At least I had people to support me in this chaos, even if my own son was incapable of doing so. The staff finished cleaning up, and the restaurant slowly emptied. I sat in my office going over invoices and reports, trying to distract myself from thoughts of what had happened. But images of tonight kept popping up in my mind. The shocked look on Keith's face when he learned the truth, the fury in Rosemary's eyes, the awkwardness of their friends. I did what I had to do. I'd restored my dignity, made them feel at least some of the humiliation they'd made me feel. But then why did victory seem so hollow? I spent the next 3 days after the incident at the restaurant at home, not answering my cell phone or making contact with the outside world. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Keith and Rosemary tried to reach me with enviable persistence. I could see their names on the screen, but each time I pressed the reject button. I wasn't ready to talk to them yet. On the morning of the 4th day, I finally decided to come out of my voluntary recluse. The weather was overcast, the sky covered with heavy gray clouds, which oddly matched my mood. I headed to the restaurant, feeling the need to return to the routine that had always had a calming effect on me. Mr. Pierce, Emma, the head waitress, greeted me at the entrance with genuine joy. We were worried about you. It's okay, Emma, I smiled, touched by her concern. I just needed some time to myself. Of course, she nodded understandingly. Holden said you could take as much time as you needed. We've been managing. I'm sure we did, I replied as I made my way into the lounge. The restaurant was just getting ready to open. The waiters were setting up tables. The bartenders were checking the stock. The kitchen was filled with appetizing smells. It was business as usual, and it had a calming effect. I felt more at home here at the waterfront than in my own apartment. I made my way to my office where a stack of letters and documents demanding my attention was waiting for me. Among them, I noticed an envelope from Keith, a plain white envelope without a stamp, apparently delivered personally. I put it aside, deciding to attend to more pressing matters first. Not an hour later, there was a knock on the office door, and Holden came in. He looked surprised to see me at my desk. Vince, huh? I didn't think you'd be back so soon. You can't hide forever, I shrugged. Besides, I'm better here. Holden sat down in the chair across from me. How are you? I thought about it, trying to formulate an answer. How was I feeling? The anger from that night had faded, but it was replaced by a strange emptiness mixed with bitterness. I don't know, I answered honestly. Often, sometimes I think I did the right thing. Other times I think I made it worse. Your son called the restaurant every day, Holden said, trying to find out where you were and when you'd be back. And what did you tell him? That I had no idea. Holden smiled slightly. Which was true. I nodded, grateful for his tactfulness. He also came here yesterday, Holden continued. Alone, without Rosemary. That surprised me. Keith rarely did anything without his wife, especially when it came to family matters. And what did he want? To talk to you, Holden answered. He looked different, not as confident as usual. I glanced at the envelope on the table. He left this? Yes, he said it was important. I took the envelope in my hands but didn't open it. Do you think he's truly sorry? I asked Holden. My friend hesitated, weighing the answer. Honestly, I don't know, but he looked concerned. Maybe he finally realized he'd gone too far. I sighed. Did I know my son well enough to judge his sincerity? Could I trust my instincts after so many years of deception and disappointment? I began, setting aside the envelope. Have you ever thought about how family is a strange concept? We don't choose which family to be born into. We don't choose our parents or our children. But we are somehow obligated to love them, to respect them, to maintain the relationship even if it hurts us. I think family is more than just blood, Holden replied. It's a choice we make every day. Blood kinship just gives us a starting point, but true family is built through actions, through caring, through mutual respect. I nodded, agreeing with what he said. And when that respect isn't there, when a relationship becomes toxic, destructive, then maybe you have to have the courage to admit that some relationships aren't worth keeping. Holden looked me straight in the eye. Even if it's a family. The thought was both painful and liberating. For years, I'd clung to the idea that Keith was my son, and therefore I was obligated to tolerate his neglect, his arrogance, his constant judgment. But what if that's not true? What if I'm entitled to a relationship that doesn't hurt me, even if it means giving up blood ties? I don't know if I can let him go completely, I admitted. He's my only child after all. It's your decision, Vince, Holden said softly. Whichever one you make, I'll support you. I smiled gratefully. Holden wasn't related to me by blood, but over the years he'd grown closer to me than most relatives. Thank you, Hold, for everything. He nodded and stood up. I need to check on supplies. I'll see you later. When Holden left, I finally decided to open the envelope from Keith. Inside was a short letter written in his neat handwriting. Dad, I hope you will read this letter. After that evening, Rosemary and I thought a lot about our relationship and how we treated you all those years ago. We realized that our behavior was unacceptable, and we sincerely regret it. We would like to meet with you to apologize in person and try to repair the relationship. Family is very important, and we don't want to lose you because of our mistakes. Please call me when you are ready to talk. Love, Keith. I read the letter several times, trying to find something in it that I didn't notice the first time. The words sounded right, but something about them made me doubt it. Maybe the phrase about family, which seemed too convenient after he'd learned of my financial situation, or the general formality of the tone, as if he was writing a business letter rather than addressing his father. I set the letter aside and pulled out my cell phone. It had 6 missed calls from Keith and 4 from Rosemary, as well as a few messages I hadn't read. I opened the first of them. Dad, we need to talk. Call me, please. The second was more insistent. I understand you're angry, but we need to talk about what happened. It's important. The third message was from Rosemary. Winston, Keith, and I would like to apologize for our behavior. Please give us a chance to explain. I went through the messages one by one, and a strange sense of déjà vu encompassed me. How many times over the years had I tried to patch things up with Keith? How many times had I called him, texted him, tried to meet, only to get a polite but cold rejection or a promise to call him back that was never fulfilled? And now that he had learned about my financial situation, about restaurants, he suddenly remembered the importance of family ties. Coincidence? I doubted it. I dialed the number, but not of Keith, but of my attorney, Martin Page. We'd worked together for years, and I trusted his judgment. Winston, he greeted me. Good to hear from you. How are you? I've been better, Martin, I answered honestly. I have a favor to ask of you. I want to change my will. There was a pause on the other end of the line. It's a big step, Martin finally said. Are you sure? Yes, I answered firmly. More than sure. Good, I can come to you tomorrow and we can discuss the details. I'll be waiting. After the conversation with the lawyer, I felt strangely relieved, as if I'd made a decision I'd been putting off for a long time. Keith was my sole heir, and for years I had no doubt that all my property should go to him when I died. But now? Now I wasn't so sure. The phone rang again, and Keith's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a long minute, but finally decided not to answer. It wasn't time yet. I had to sort out my own feelings first, figure out what I really wanted out of this relationship, and whether it was even possible to repair what had been broken. Instead, I went back to work, reviewing financial reports and planning the next month's menu. Work had always been my sanctuary, a place where I felt competent and confident. Here at the restaurant, I knew who I was and what I was doing. Here there was no room for the doubts and insecurities that haunted my relationship with my son. Toward evening, as the restaurant began to fill with customers, I stepped out into the hall. Many of the regulars greeted me with nods and smiles, some stopping to say a few words. I moved between tables, watching the staff at work, occasionally helping with small tasks. At one of the tables, I noticed a not-so-young couple, a man and woman in their 60s, who were clearly enjoying their dinner. They held hands across the table and chatted quietly, occasionally laughing at something only the two of them understood. Something about their interaction, the warmth, the comfort, the deep connection, touched me. Perhaps it was something I had never had with Helen and was sorely lacking in my life. I was back in my office when the phone rang again. This time it was Rosemary. Yes, I answered, deciding it was pointless to ignore their calls any longer. Winston, her voice sounded softer than usual. Finally, Keith and I were so worried. Really? I couldn't hold back the sarcasm. Of course, she assured me. We want to apologize for our behavior. It was inexcusable. And yet you're trying to get forgiveness, I remarked. Rosemary was silent for a moment, obviously searching for words. We were wrong, she said at last, and we want to make it right. Keith is very worried. He wants to talk to you. About what? I asked. About how he's going to sue me? No, Rosemary answered quickly. That was said in the heat of the moment. He never intended to do that. And the lawyer who called me? Was that in the heat of the moment too? She was silent again, and I could almost see her mentally going over possible answers. Keith was upset and confused, she finally said. He hadn't been thinking clearly, but now he's realized his mistake, and he wants to make things right. We both do. I sighed. There was an insistence in her voice that seemed suspicious to me. Rosemary, be honest, I asked. What's changed? Why this sudden desire to mend a relationship that for years had been strained at best? We have rethought our priorities, she answered after a pause. Family's more important than we thought. Family's more important, I repeated. Or are my restaurants more important? Winston, there was indignation in her voice. How can you think that? We've never… Rosemary, I interrupted her. In the 5 years since Helen died, you've never once asked me to dinner. Never once asked me how I was doing. Never once tried to really get to know me. And suddenly, when it turns out I'm not a poor old construction worker, but a successful restaurateur, you remember the importance of family ties? She was silent, and her silence was more eloquent than any words. I will think about your proposal, I said. But right now I need time. Haha, of course. Her voice became soft again. We'll be waiting for your call. I ended the conversation feeling a strange mixture of emotions. Part of me wanted to believe in the sincerity of their apology, in the possibility of reconciliation. But the other, more cynical part suspected that their sudden concern had more prosaic reasons. There was another knock on the office door, and Holden came in. Is everything all right? He asked, seeing the look on my face. Sir, Rosemary just called, I answered. She and Keith want to meet, apologize, patch things up. And you believe them, I wondered? I don't know. I want to believe them. But their sudden desire for reconciliation coincided suspiciously with the discovery of your financial situation? Holden finished for me. Exactly, I nodded. If they really valued me as a father and father-in-law, they wouldn't have acted like this all these years. Something doesn't add up. What are you going to do? Nothing yet, I answered. Martin, my lawyer, is coming tomorrow. We'll change the will. Are you sure you want to do that? Holden looked worried. It's a big step. I haven't decided exactly how I'm going to change it yet, I admitted. But I don't think Keith should get everything just because he's my son, especially after the way he's been acting. Holden nodded, not trying to talk me out of it. What about meeting with them? Maybe later, I said. I want to get my affairs and my thoughts in order first. We continued to discuss the current affairs of the restaurant, but my thoughts kept returning to Keith and Rosemary. I remembered their faces that night. Shock, disbelief, and then a strange mixture of anger and calculation. They were humiliated, but I suspected they were more concerned about losing face in front of their friends than how they'd treated me all those years ago. After Holden left, I sat in my office for a while longer, reviewing my financials. 2 successful restaurants, investments, real estate. In 15 years, I'd accumulated a considerable fortune. And all that time I'd lived modestly, not publicizing my success, partly out of natural restraint, partly out of pride. I wanted Keith to see me as something more than just a source of money. But perhaps I was naive. Perhaps to Keith and Rosemary, with their materialistic view of the world, a man without money or status simply didn't deserve respect. And now that they knew of my situation, their attitude toward me changed dramatically. The next morning, as promised, Martin Page arrived. My lawyer was a soft-spoken, practical man whom I respected for his professionalism and honesty. "So," he said, laying out the papers on the table, "you want to change your will. What exactly do you plan to do?" I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. "I don't want Keith to be my sole heir anymore," I said, "but I haven't decided exactly how to distribute the estate." Martin nodded without showing surprise. "There are several options. You could set up a trust with certain conditions. You could leave some of the estate to charity. You can appoint other heirs if there are any," I wondered. I had no other close relatives, but there was an idea that had been forming in my head for the past few days. "What if I wanted to leave the restaurants to their employees?" I asked. "Create some sort of cooperative where everyone would get a share based on seniority?" Martin raised his eyebrows. "It's an unusual solution, but it's quite feasible. We can create a structure that will ensure a smooth transition of ownership and management after your death. It will require careful planning, but it is possible." "And the rest of the estate?" I asked. "Investments? Real estate?" "We could split it up," Martin suggested. "Some to Keith, some to charity, some to a trust for some specific purpose that matters to you." I nodded, feeling that I was moving in the right direction. "Prepare a draft with these ideas," I asked. "I will think about it and make a final decision later." Martin started drafting the documents while I looked out the window at the street where people were hurrying about their business. A strange sense of freedom swept over me. Freedom from expectations, from a sense of duty, from the need to maintain a relationship that only caused pain. I didn't know if I would ever meet Keith and Rosemary, if I would ever be able to forgive them or find common ground with them. But I did know that I would no longer let them dictate how I should feel or what I should do with my life. This was my decision, my choice, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was doing the right thing. 3 weeks flew by. After changing my will, I felt strangely relieved, as if I had been relieved of a heavy burden I had been carrying for years. I decided to leave Keith only a small portion of my inheritance, enough to prevent him from contesting the will on the grounds that I had wrongfully disinherited him, but no more than that. I distributed the bulk of my estate to the employees of the restaurants, setting up a special trust that would ensure that they would share in the business after my death. During those 3 weeks, I never once spoke to Keith or Rosemary, although they continued to call and text with enviable persistence. Instead, I focused on myself and my life. For the first time in years, I thought about what I wanted for myself, not how my actions would be perceived by my son or how they would affect our already complicated relationship. The first step was moving from a modest apartment on Bridge Street to a spacious penthouse in a new complex on the banks of the Feather River. I had always been able to afford better housing, but I preferred to live modestly, partly out of habit, partly out of a strange feeling that I wasn't entitled to luxury. Now I decided that at my 68, I had every right to comfort. The penthouse was bright, with large windows and a terrace overlooking the river. I ordered minimalist furniture, which I had always liked but had never dared to buy from my old apartment. I installed a grand piano in the living room. I had taken music lessons as a child and always wanted to get back to it, but never found the time. The next step was to change my public image in the restaurant. I no longer pretended to be a mere assistant. Now everyone knew I was the owner of the Coastal. This caused quite a few surprised looks and conversations among the regulars, but most of them treated the news with respect and even some admiration. "Mr. Pierce, I always knew you were here for a reason." Archer Thompson, an elderly professor who ate lunch at the restaurant every Wednesday, told me, "You've always had a sense of thoroughness." "Thank you, Professor," I smiled. "Sometimes it's easier to observe from the outside. And yet," he said thoughtfully, "you can't hide in the shadows forever. Sooner or later, you have to come out into the light." His words seemed almost prophetic. That's what I was doing now, coming out of the shadows I'd been hiding in for too long. One sunny morning, I decided to visit an art gallery downtown. Art had always attracted me, but I had rarely made time for such frivolous pursuits before. Now, however, I decided it was time to make up for lost time. The gallery was small but well organized, with an interesting collection of works by local artists. I was slowly moving from painting to painting, enjoying the play of color and form, when I heard a familiar voice. Winston? Winston Pierce? I turned around and saw Odelia Parker. We hadn't met in 20 years, but I recognized her immediately. The same bright eyes, the same warm smile. Of course, time had left its marks, the gray in her brown hair, the wrinkles in the corners of her eyes. But it was undeniably her. Odelia. I couldn't hold back a smile. What a surprise. I can't believe it. She stepped closer. It's been so many years. We'd met before my marriage to Helen. Odelia worked for the architectural firm my construction company was working with. There was an instant attraction, and we dated for a while. But then I met Helen, and Odelia and I went our separate ways. I heard she got married and moved to Portland. Are you back in Yuba City? I asked. I came back 2 years ago after my divorce, she replied. Sure, my son lives here with his family, and I wanted to be closer to my grandchildren. Grandchildren, I shook my head. How fast time flies. Don't tell me, Odelia laughed. Every time they call me grandmother, I flinch. I'm still 30 at heart. We talked, moving from painting to painting. Odelia told me that after architecture she went into interior design, but now she is retired and passionate about painting. I shared a story about my restaurants, of course, without mentioning the recent incident with Keith. You've always been ambitious, Odelia said. I remember you saying that one day you'd build the tallest skyscraper in Sacramento. Did you? I laughed. I don't remember that, but it sounds like me when I was young. What about your family? When she asked. Are you married? Divorced a long time ago. My wife died 5 years ago, I answered. I have a son, but, our relationship is complicated. Odelia nodded understandingly, not asking further, for which I was grateful. Listen, I said when we finished looking at the exhibit, why don't we have dinner sometime? I know a great restaurant. Let me guess. The Coastal? She smiled. How did you guess? I pretended to be surprised. The whole town is talking about how a humble assistant ended up owning the best restaurant in the neighborhood, Odelia said. It's the most interesting gossip I've heard in the last month. Oh God, I covered my face with my hand. I hope they don't go into too much detail. Don't worry, she put her hand on my shoulder. People are more impressed than judgmental. And yes, I'd love to have dinner with you. We exchanged numbers and arranged to meet the next night. I drove home with a light heart, feeling a strange excitement I hadn't felt in a very long time. At the restaurant, I was met by Holden, who immediately noticed my high spirits. Somebody's in a good mood tonight, he said. Did something happen? I met an old acquaintance, I replied. Odelia Parker. We haven't seen each other in 20 years. E? Holden raised an eyebrow. And we're having dinner tomorrow. I couldn't hold back a smile. That's news, Holden looked genuinely pleased. Good for you, Vince. It's just dinner, I tried to dampen his enthusiasm. We're just old friends. Of course, well, he looked at me skeptically. And that's why you're shining like a Christmas tree. I wanted to object, but I laughed instead. Maybe Holden was right. Maybe I really was more excited about the upcoming meeting than I was willing to admit. The evening with Odelia turned out to be one of the most enjoyable I'd had in years. We talked about everything. The past, our careers, children and grandchildren. Odelia had 3. Books and movies and plans for the future. She was as smart and interesting as I remembered her, with the same sharp wit and sense of humor. By the end of the evening, I caught myself thinking that I didn't want it to end. Why don't we do it again sometime? I suggested as I walked her to the cab. I'd love to, Odelia replied. It was a pleasure. We agreed to meet again, and in the following weeks we saw each other regularly, either in a restaurant or at a concert at the local Philharmonic, or just walking along the seafront. There was an ease of communication between us that only happens between people who understand each other well. In addition to my meetings with Odelia, I began to actively engage in other activities that I had previously lacked the time or determination to do. I resumed my piano lessons, enrolled in Italian language courses. I had always dreamed of visiting Tuscany, and started regularly attending the local fitness club for the elderly. You've changed, Holden noticed one day when we were sitting in my office discussing plans to expand the restaurant. You look Younger. I feel younger, I admitted. It's like I've lost years along with, I hesitated. Abu, with the burden of being with Keith? Holden finished for me. I nodded. We both knew it was true. The end of trying to get my son's approval, the release from the constant feelings of guilt and inferiority, it gave me a new sense of freedom. Keith and Rosemary continued to try to contact me, but I ignored their calls and messages. Not out of revenge or resentment, but simply because I no longer felt the need for that relationship. I finally accepted that sometimes it's better to let go than to keep clinging to something that hurts. Martin, my attorney, reported that he had completed all the legal formalities with the new will. Everything is ready as you wanted, he said, handing me the documents. Keith will get 10% of the total value of the estate, enough to keep him from contesting the will, but no more than that. And the rest? I asked. 70% will go to a trust fund for restaurant employees, just like you planned. 20% to charity, the programs to support the elderly and disadvantaged children you chose. I nodded, pleased with the result. It seemed a fair distribution of what I had accumulated over my life. One evening, Odelia and I, along with a few other friends I'd met in Italian class, had a small dinner in a private office of the Coastal. Everett outdid himself by preparing a special menu featuring Tuscan cuisine, and Holden picked out the perfect Italian wines. The evening was in full swing. We were discussing an upcoming trip to Italy we were planning for the fall, when Holden quietly approached me. "Vince," he said softly, "Keith and Rosemary are here. They insist on meeting with you." I felt my shoulders tense. I'd almost forgotten about them during the weeks I'd been immersed in my new life. "What are they saying?" I asked. "That it's important that they don't leave until they talk to you," Holden answered. "I told them you're busy, but they insist." I looked at Odalia and the other guests, who continued their conversation without noticing our conversation with Holden. They were part of my new life, a life where I was happy, where I was respected and appreciated for who I was, not what I had. "Tell them I can't accept them right now," I said firmly, "and I don't want them to interfere with our evening. If they don't leave voluntarily, call security." Holden looked surprised at my firmness, but nodded and walked out. I went back to my conversation, trying not to think about what was going on in the main room of the restaurant. But after a few minutes, I noticed movement at the glass door of the office. Keith and Rosemary were standing there, staring intently into the room. I could see the guard trying to push them away, but they resisted, unwilling to leave. Keith looked annoyed. Rosemary looked determined and a little frightened. For a moment, our gazes met through the glass. In Keith's eyes, I saw a strange mixture of emotions: anger, disappointment, and something else that could have been regret or a request. Rosemary was saying something, her lips moving, but I couldn't hear the words through the soundproof glass. At that moment, Odelia touched my arm, drawing my attention to some joke Professor James, one of our new friends, had just told. I turned to her, smiled, and joined in the general laughter. And when I looked at the door again, Keith and Rosemary were gone. The guards had apparently convinced them to leave. A strange feeling came over me. Not regret, not gloating, but something akin to relief. It was as if the last thread tying me to the past had finally been severed, freeing me for something new. "Is everything all right?" Odelia asked, noticing my pensive expression. "Yes," I answered, and for the first time in a long time, it was the truth. Everything was exactly as it should be. Later, when Odalia and I were walking along the promenade after dinner, I told her about Keith and what had happened in the last few months. "You don't have any regrets?" she asked when I was done. "About not talking to him today," I wondered. Did I regret it? Part of me, of course, mourned the loss of the relationship, the fact that my only son had become practically a stranger. But the other part of me realized that our relationship had been nothing but painful for a long time. "No," I finally answered. "I have no regrets. I think there are some relationships that can't or shouldn't be saved. And sometimes you have to have the courage to admit it." Odelia silently squeezed my hand for support. We continued walking, talking about our upcoming trip to Italy, about the books we'd recently read, about the 1,000 little things that made up everyday life, and I realized that I was truly happy for the first time in years. The next morning, I found a letter from Keith in my mailbox. Not an email, but a real paper letter in an envelope. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if I should open it. In the end, I decided not to. Whatever Keith had written there, apologies, threats, attempts at manipulation, it didn't matter anymore. I put the letter in my desk drawer without printing it out. My new life was just beginning, and I was determined to live it the way I wanted to live it. Honestly, without masks or pretense, surrounded by people who saw me as a person, not a status or a bank account. And if Keith ever realized what he'd lost in pursuit of his material goals, well, maybe then we could start over. In the meantime, I kept moving forward without looking back.